The explosion happened at exactly 3:47 in the morning. No warning, no sirens, just a wall of fire rising 40 meters into the sky above one of the most critical energy installations in the entire Middle East. And within 6 hours, the price of oil jumped $12 per barrel on every exchange from London to Singapore. But here's what nobody told you. That was not the real attack. That was the distraction. Welcome. What you are about to hear in the next 13 minutes will fundamentally change how you understand what is happening right now between Iran, Israel, and the United States. Because the war you are watching on your screens is not the war that actually matters. The missiles, the airstrikes, the press conferences, the tweets, all of it is the performance. And behind that performance, a completely different conflict is being fought. One without bombs, one without soldiers, one that will determine who controls the Middle East for the next 50 years. And right now, the side you think is winning is actually losing. Badly. Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, I am going to show you 3 things that will make your jaw drop. First, how Iran turned billions of dollars worth of American and Israeli precision weapons into the most expensive fireworks display in military history. Second, how the moment those missiles started falling, Vladimir Putin quietly became the most powerful man in the Middle East without firing a single bullet. And third, the number. A number so massive, so audacious, so strategically brilliant that when Israeli officials first heard it, the room reportedly went completely silent. $270 billion, not million, billion. And that number is just the opening offer. But before we get there, I need you to understand something that most analysts are completely missing. This conflict did not begin with airstrikes. It did not begin with drone attacks or proxy skirmishes. It began in a room full of engineers, military planners, and intelligence officers in Iran roughly 15 years ago. And what they built in that room, deep inside the granite mountains of Hormuzgan province, is what has just made the entire Western military establishment look like it spent $1 trillion shooting at shadows. Think about what we were told. For weeks, the narrative was clear and confident. Israeli and American forces had systematically dismantled Iran's air force. Satellite imagery was released. Analysts counted the wreckage. Officials gave briefings. Runways destroyed. Hangars obliterated. Fighter jets reduced to burning metal. The operation was being described as a textbook example of precision warfare. Trump posted about it. Israeli commanders held press conferences. The story was clean, simple, and completely wrong. On the 17th day of the conflict, a high-level Pakistani diplomatic delegation arrived in Tehran. And what Iran chose to show them at that precise moment in front of international witnesses was not desperation, not improvisation, not the last gasping remnants of a broken military. What appeared in the skies above Iran were organized formations. F-4 Phantoms, MiG-29s, attack helicopters flying in coordinated patterns with fighter escorts. Not a handful of survivors scrounged together for show. A complete, disciplined, combat-ready Air Force performing as if the previous 3 weeks of bombardment had never happened, because for them, it essentially had not. Here's what Iran understood that their adversaries did not. In the age of satellites and precision targeting, what your enemy sees is exactly what you want them to see. For years, Iran had been pre-positioning decommissioned airframes, old F-7 fighters, worn-out Sukhoi 22s. They placed them carefully on runways, in hangars, in positions that looked exactly like an active air force to any reconnaissance drone or satellite passing overhead. They were decoys, elaborate, patient, expensive decoys, and the coalition hit every single one of them with multi-million-dollar missiles, while the real aircraft disappeared underground. The facility that made this possible is something that deserves its own conversation. Carved hundreds of meters into solid granite in Hormuzgan province, Iran built what can only be described as an underground air force base that is also a complete military ecosystem, runways that extend from deep inside the mountain and emerge at the surface, hardened hangars, fuel storage, weapons depots, maintenance facilities, all of it buried beneath natural rock armor designed to survive even the most advanced bunker-penetrating munitions in the American arsenal. While the coalition was celebrating the destruction of what turned out to be scrap metal, Iran's actual combat aircraft were sitting safely underground, engines maintained, pilots rested, weapons ready, waiting. And they chose Day 17, during an international visit in front of witnesses. The psychological precision of that timing is as impressive as the engineering beneath those mountains. Iran did not just preserve its air force. It preserved it specifically so it could be revealed at the moment of maximum diplomatic and psychological impact. That is not military doctrine. That is theater. And it worked perfectly. Now consider what this means for the financial dimension of this conflict, because this is where things get truly extraordinary. The strikes on Iran targeted oil refineries, natural gas processing facilities, power generation infrastructure, industrial plants, seaports, aluminum and steel production. The kind of damage that takes years and enormous capital to rebuild. Iran commissioned its own damage assessment. And the preliminary figure that came back, the number that was then placed on the negotiation table as a precondition for any ceasefire discussion, was $270 billion. To understand why that number is so strategically devastating, you need one piece of context. Iran's entire annual GDP sits somewhere between $400 and $450 billion. So Iran is essentially saying, before we discuss peace, you owe us more than half of everything our entire economy produces in a year, in a single payment. This is not negotiation in the traditional sense. This is a judo move. By framing the conflict in financial terms, by forcing the conversation into the language of accountability and reparations, Iran has done something profound. It has shifted the battlefield from one where America and Israel have overwhelming advantage to one where their very aggression becomes their liability. Every destroyed refinery is not a victory anymore. It is a line item on an invoice. Every bombed power plant is not a tactical success. It is a debt. And who eventually has to pay that debt? Israel's own Ministry of Finance has already confirmed that the direct budget costs of this conflict have exceeded $11 billion. That is just the direct military expenditure. Add the collapse of tourism, the slowdown of investment, the drain on reserve systems, the economic disruption to ordinary Israeli life, and the real number is considerably higher. Israel does not have $270 billion. Nobody is pretending it does. The point of the demand is not payment. The point is the conversation it forces, the international attention it draws, and the position it creates at any future negotiation table. Iran walks into every discussion from now on holding a legitimate, documented claim that transforms it from aggressor in the Western narrative to victim seeking redress. It is brilliant, and it cost Iran nothing to file it. But here is the part of this story that has received almost no attention, and it may be the most consequential development of this entire conflict. While all of this was unfolding, while missiles were flying and press conferences were being held and satellite images were being analyzed, something was happening in global energy markets that had nothing to do with military power and everything to do with economic reality. When tensions around the Strait of Hormuz escalated, when the possibility of disruption to the roughly 20% of global oil supply that flows through that narrow channel became real, Asian refineries panicked. These are not small operations. These are massive industrial facilities in China, South Korea, Japan, and India that cannot simply pause operations while they wait for futures markets to stabilize. They needed oil, physical, deliverable, real oil, not contracts, not paper promises, actual crude that could be loaded onto tankers and refined within weeks. And the only supplier with the infrastructure, the tanker capacity, the existing payment channels, and the political willingness to deliver at scale was Russia. Russian Urals crude, which had been trading at a significant discount to Western benchmarks, largely because of sanctions, suddenly became the most sought-after oil on the planet. The price surged to $120 per barrel. American WTI, the benchmark that Trump loves to reference when talking about energy dominance, slid into the 90s. Russian oil became more expensive than American oil because the world needed it more urgently, and Russia had built the systems to deliver it when no one else could. This is the outcome of years of patient preparation by Moscow. While Western governments were imposing sanctions and celebrating the impact on Russia's energy revenues, Russia was building what it calls its shadow fleet, hundreds of tankers operating outside Western insurance systems, outside Western financial infrastructure, connected to payment mechanisms that bypassed SWIFT and dollar clearing entirely. The sanctions were meant to isolate Russia. Instead, they forced Russia to build a completely parallel logistics system. And when the crisis hit, that system worked. Russian tankers kept sailing, Russian oil kept flowing, and the revenue kept arriving. For every additional $5 per barrel on top of baseline prices across millions of barrels per day, the extra money flowing into Russian government accounts is staggering. Tens of millions of dollars per day, real cash, not paper profits, not market cap. Hard currency flowing into a state treasury that funds both economic stability and military capacity, and it is flowing because of a conflict that Trump initiated, escalated, and is still presenting to his domestic audience as a strategic success. The irony is almost too perfect to believe. America deploys naval forces to the Strait of Hormuz to project power and pressure Iran. The disruption that results drives energy-hungry Asian economies into the arms of Russia. Russia becomes richer. Russia becomes more strategically indispensable. And America, which was supposed to be demonstrating dominance, has instead performed an enormously expensive favor for its primary geopolitical rival in Europe. And speaking of Europe, there is one more dimension to this story that does not get discussed enough. Because while everyone is focused on the Middle East theater, something is quietly happening inside NATO that could prove to be the most lasting consequence of this entire episode. Alliances are not held together by treaties. They are held together by shared interests. And shared interests are almost always about economics before they are about ideology. Hungary has energy contracts with Russia that run until 2036. Its oil supply comes primarily through the Druzhba pipeline. No matter what pressure Brussels or Washington applies, the Hungarian government has to make a calculation every single day. Pay Russian prices or pay much higher Western prices and tell Hungarian households their heating bills are doubling. That calculation has a very predictable answer. And Hungary is not alone. Slovenia is having its own quiet debates about NATO commitments and energy sourcing. Serbia, never a full member but critically positioned geographically in the Balkans, maintains deep ties to Moscow and has shown no meaningful interest in aligning fully with Western demands. Together, these three countries sit across the primary land corridors that NATO would need to rapidly move armored forces from Western and Central Europe toward the eastern flank. If those transit permissions become uncertain, if overflight rights become conditional, if the political will to facilitate rapid reinforcement evaporates, America's massive military advantage in hardware becomes considerably less useful. You cannot deploy a tank brigade that cannot move through the territory between it and its objective. Putin does not need to send troops into Europe to achieve this effect. He simply needs to keep Russian energy cheap, keep the offers open, and let the laws of economics do the rest. Every time Trump escalates in the Middle East and drives global energy prices higher, he makes Russian gas more attractive to European governments trying to keep their populations warm and their factories running. Every sanction that raises costs for European businesses is a subsidy to Russian influence. Trump has built a strategy that works against itself. So let us step back and look at the complete picture because it is remarkable. Iran survives a massive bombing campaign by hiding its real assets underground and sacrificing decoys worth a fraction of what the coalition spent destroying them. Iran then presents a compensation demand so large it reframes the entire conflict in terms of accountability rather than military outcome. Russia watches oil prices surge and collects billions in additional revenue it can channel directly into economic stability and military capacity. Turkey, which has spent 2 decades quietly building an independent defense industry and reducing its dependence on foreign weapon systems, watches the 2 dominant players in the region exhaust themselves and begins positioning for the influence vacuum that is opening. And NATO, the alliance that is supposed to be America's ultimate trump card in any strategic standoff, is developing stress fractures in exactly the geographic locations that matter most for military logistics. And in the middle of all of this, 10,000 American troops are stationed near the Strait of Hormuz, unable to decisively act because any major military escalation would send oil prices to levels that would cause a global recession, which would devastate the American economy first, which would immediately become a domestic political crisis for the administration that caused it. This is the trap. The military is deployed, the pressure is applied. But the trigger cannot be pulled because the consequences of pulling it fall hardest on the country holding the gun. That is not strength. That is a very expensive performance of strength with no available follow-through. The underground Air Force is still flying. The $270 billion bill is still on the table. The oil revenue is still flowing to Moscow. The alliance is still fracturing quietly. And the conflict that was supposed to be quick, decisive, and cheap is now entering a phase where none of the original objectives have been achieved and the costs continue to compound. History will look back at this period as a decisive turning point, not because of a dramatic battle or a sudden collapse, but because of the slow, patient, methodical way that 3 countries, Iran, Russia, and to a growing extent Turkey, used economic reality, strategic deception, and the compounding costs of overreach to fundamentally alter the balance of power in a region that America has tried to dominate for decades. The bombs got the headlines, the numbers will determine the outcome, and right now the numbers do not favor the side that spent the most on the bombs. Thank you for watching. If this analysis gave you something real to think about, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave your thoughts below, and subscribe, because the next episode will cover what happens when the full damage assessment comes back and Iran updates that $270 billion figure. Based on what we know now, the revised number is going to be significantly higher, and the conversation that follows is going to change everything.